Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of West Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The winter of 1902 was unusually harsh in Rockford County, West Virginia. The kind of cold that seems to penetrate not just through clothing, but through walls, through time itself. It was during this winter that Dr. Thomas Ellsworth established what would later become known as the Ellsworth Sanatorium, perched atop Blackwater Ridge, approximately 7 miles north of the coal mining town of Coalfield. What remains of that institution today is little more than crumbling stonework reclaimed by the dense Appalachian forest. But the documents that survived, the ones that weren't deliberately destroyed, tell a story far more disturbing than any ghost tale whispered around campfires in those mountains. The story begins with a series of unmarked graves discovered in 1974 during a forestry survey. 23 shallow depressions in the earth arranged in an unnervingly precise grid pattern approximately 300 yards behind what remained of the sanatorium's east wing. According to county records, these graves weren't supposed to exist. The institution had its own cemetery, properly documented, on the western slope of the property. These graves were something else entirely. The Ellsworth family was once prominent in West Virginia medicine. Thomas Ellsworth came from 3 generations of physicians. His grandfather had served as a field surgeon during the Civil War. His father had established the first proper hospital in Rockford County, and Thomas himself had studied at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, where his thesis on moral treatment and physical interventions in cases of degenerative mental afflictions had received considerable attention. The Ellsworth Sanatorium was intended to be his legacy. Documents from the Rockford Historical Society describe the opening ceremony as a gathering of the region's most influential citizens. The 3-story stone building with its distinctive central tower and 2 extending wings was described in a local newspaper article as a beacon of modern psychiatric treatment in a region long plagued by superstition and primitive approaches to mental distress. The original patient ledger, recovered from the county archives in 1986, lists 37 patients admitted during the first month of operation. Their names have been redacted from public records, but their described conditions reflect the psychiatric terminology of the era: melancholia, hysteria, mania, dementia praecox, and most frequently, moral insanity. A catch-all diagnosis often applied to those whose behavior simply deviated from social norms. What's particularly noteworthy about these initial admissions is that 22 of them were women between the ages of 19 and 40. According to hospital records, 15 of these women had been committed by their husbands, 5 by their fathers, and 2 by their brothers. The grounds for commitment included excessive reading, argumentative disposition, refusal of wifely duties, and in one case, simply unsuitable melancholy following the death of a child. The remaining patients were predominantly older men suffering from what would today likely be diagnosed as dementia, and young men exhibiting symptoms consistent with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress, many of them veterans of the Spanish-American War. For the first 5 years, the Ellsworth Sanatorium appeared, on paper at least, to be exactly what it claimed to be. Annual reports to the West Virginia Board of Health detailed treatments consistent with the era's understanding of psychiatric care: rest cures, hydrotherapy, work therapy in the institution's gardens, and occasional use of sedatives for the most agitated patients. But in March of 1907, something changed. The Rockford County Telegraph published a small article noting that Dr. Thomas Ellsworth had returned from a 6-month tour of European medical institutions with innovative approaches to the treatment of the most difficult cases of mental derangement. What these innovative approaches entailed wasn't specified in the article, but the hospital's records following his return tell a disturbing story. A ledger recovered from the attic of Ellsworth's former residence in 1990 contains entries that don't appear in the official reports submitted to state authorities. This private record, written in Ellsworth's distinctive handwriting, details a series of what he termed special procedures administered to patients who showed insufficient progress through conventional methods. One entry from April 12, 1907, reads, "Subject E demonstrates continued resistance to moral treatment. Implemented first phase of the Geneva Protocol. Subject exhibited extreme distress but showed markedly increased compliance in the hours following the procedure. Will continue to observe." Another entry, dated June 23rd of the same year, notes, "Subjects G, L, and P have been transferred to the East Wing for extended application of the protocol. All three cases show promising signs of the dissolution of previous personality structures. The rebuilding phase will commence once complete compliance is achieved." What exactly the Geneva Protocol entailed isn't explicitly stated in Ellsworth's notes. However, architectural plans of the sanatorium filed with the county show that the East Wing, where these special procedures were conducted, contained a series of unusually small rooms in the basement level, each with reinforced doors, and what the blueprints label as drainage systems. In 1908, Dr. Ian Ellsworth hired his nephew, Dr. Frederick Ellsworth, as his assistant. Frederick had also studied medicine, though at the less prestigious West Virginia University. His thesis, interestingly, focused on the physiological manifestations of moral corruption, a pseudo-scientific concept that attempted to link perceived moral failings to physical abnormalities. Together, the two Ellsworths expanded the sanatorium's capacity, adding a new building that connected to the main structure via an underground passage. This new facility, referred to in documents simply as the Annex, doesn't appear on any official blueprints filed with the county. Its existence is known only through references in the doctor's private correspondence and through ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 1998. A series of letters between Thomas and Frederick discovered in a wall cavity during the partial demolition of the property in 1968 suggest that the Annex served a very specific purpose. One letter, dated September 3, 1909, contains a particularly chilling passage. The conversion rate has increased significantly since implementing the modifications to the protocol. 8 of the 12 subjects in Series C have now reached Stage 4. 2 expired during the transition from Stage 3 to 4, but this represents an improvement over previous results. I believe we are approaching a breakthrough in the reformation of the degenerate mind. The nature of these stages and what conversion meant in this context isn't entirely clear. What is clear is that patients transferred to the Annex rarely return to the main building, and their names begin to disappear from official records, often with only a brief notation, transferred or treatment concluded. During this period, the sanatorium's reported death rate remained suspiciously low compared to similar institutions of the era. While the average mortality at psychiatric hospitals in the early 20th century typically ranged from 12 to 20% annually, the Ellsworth Sanatorium reported rates of just 2 to 3%. This statistical anomaly went unquestioned until 1912, when a county health inspector named James Harrington made an unannounced visit to the facility. The official report from this inspection contains mostly mundane observations about the cleanliness of the kitchens and the adequacy of the heating system. However, a personal diary belonging to Harrington, discovered among his effects after his death in 1934, tells a very different story. In an entry dated October 17, 1912, Harrington wrote, "What I witnessed at Ellsworth defies explanation. The main halls were immaculate, the patients in the common areas well-dressed and strangely subdued. But there was a door, locked, leading to what Dr. E. called private treatment rooms. When I insisted on seeing these rooms, citing my authority as inspector, the good doctor's demeanor changed entirely. He explained that a sensitive treatment was in progress that could not be interrupted. When I pressed the matter, suggesting I might return the following day, he relented, though reluctantly. He said, "Very well, Mr. Harrington, return tomorrow at noon, and I will show you everything." Something in his tone, in his eyes, as he said this, filled me with inexplicable dread. I made excuses about other appointments and left without completing the inspection. God forgive my cowardice, but something told me I would not have left that place alive had I returned. Harrington never did return to complete his inspection. 3 weeks later, he was reassigned to another district. The incomplete inspection report was filed away and apparently forgotten. In February of 1913, a fire broke out in the east wing of the sanatorium. According to the Rockford County Telegraph, the blaze claimed the lives of several patients and a staff member, though the exact number and names of the victims weren't published. The newspaper account describes Dr. Thomas Ellsworth as heroic in his efforts to save those trapped inside, suffering burns to his hands and face in the process. What's strange about this incident is that no death certificates were ever filed for these supposed victims. No bodies were ever recovered, according to county coroner records. And strangest of all, there's no mention of the fire in any of Dr. Ellsworth's private journals, journals that otherwise document the day-to-day operations of the sanatorium in meticulous detail. Some researchers have suggested that the fire may have been fabricated as a cover for something else entirely. This theory gained credence in 1996, when ground-penetrating radar surveys of the East Wing ruins revealed no evidence of fire damage to the stone foundations, but did show signs of extensive structural modification that doesn't appear in any of the official blueprints. After the supposed fire, the sanatorium continued to operate, though on a reduced scale. The number of patients officially recorded in residence dropped from 87 to just 39. But the institution's consumption of supplies, food, coal, medical materials, remained consistent with pre-fire levels, according to quarterly order forms discovered in the records of the Coalfield General Store, which held the supply contract for the sanatorium at the time. The question this raises is, who were these unrecorded residents of Ellsworth Sanatorium, and what was their fate? A partial answer may lie in a set of unusual documents discovered in 1978 in the sealed attic of the Rockford County Courthouse. These papers, collectively referred to as the Ellsworth Files by researchers, contain what appear to be experimental records, though written in a coded language that has only been partially deciphered. The documents detail something called the Reformation process, a series of treatments divided into 7 distinct phases. The early phases involve isolation, sleep deprivation, and restricted diet, cruel but not uncommon practices in early 20th century asylums. The later phases, however, describe procedures that defy both medical ethics and human decency. Phase 5, for instance, is described as the dissolution of personal memory and the preparation of the vacant vessel. Phase 6 involves something called imprinting, and Phase 7 is referred to simply as rebirth. Accompanying these descriptions are tables of data, columns of numbers, and coded identifiers that seem to track the progress of multiple subjects through these phases. Most disturbing are the notations in the margins. Subject requires additional preparation before progression, or subject failed to survive transition to Phase 6. Proceed with substitute from Group C. These documents bear no official letterhead, no signatures, nothing to definitively link them to the Ellsworth Sanatorium. Yet they were found wrapped in a newspaper dated April 1914 with a partially visible article about the sanatorium's newly established Advanced Treatment Department. In the summer of 1915, something occurred at the sanatorium that marked the beginning of its end as an operating institution. County records show that on the night of June 18th, 2 patients escaped from the facility. The first message, sent at 2:17 in the morning, reads, "2 dangerous patients escaped, stop armed and unpredictable, stop request, immediate assistance stop." A response from the sheriff sent at 2:45. Deputies dispatched stop provide descriptions and likely direction of travel stop. The sanatorium's reply sent at 3:12. Male and female, stop both tall, thin, pale complexion. Stop likely heading toward Coalfield, stop extreme caution advised. Stop patients subject to violent delusions, stop. A final message from the sanatorium sent at 5:23 that morning. Disregard previous stop patients. Located on grounds. Stop situation. Resolved. Stop no further assistance. Required stop. Their names, like so many others in this story, have been redacted from public records. What we do know comes from a series of telegraph messages between the sanatorium and the Rockford County Sheriff's Office. What happened to these escapees and whether they were truly recaptured as claimed remains one of the many unanswered questions in this case. What we do know is that 3 days after this incident, a Coalfield resident named Samuel Thornton filed a report with the sheriff's office claiming to have encountered 2 ghostly figures on the road leading from Blackwater Ridge into town. According to Thornton's statement, preserved in county records, they weren't right, those 2, a man and a woman, but moving strange, like they was learning to walk all over again. Their eyes, something wasn't right about their eyes. Empty-like. When I called out to ask if they needed help, they just turned their heads toward me, real slow-like, and stared. Didn't speak, didn't blink, just stared. Then they turned, in perfect unison, mind you, and walked into the woods. I swear on my mother's grave, they moved like they was being pulled by the same string. The sheriff's report lists this as a case of intoxication leading to imaginative fears, and notes that Thornton was known locally for exaggerated tales. The matter was not investigated further. 1 week after this incident, Dr. Thomas Ellsworth made an unexpected announcement. He would be traveling to Europe again, this time for an extended period, leaving the sanatorium in the care of his nephew, Dr. Frederick Ellsworth. A notice in the Rockford County Telegraph on June 28, 1915, stated that Dr. Ellsworth would be consulting with prominent European specialists regarding advanced treatments for the most challenging cases of mental derangement. Thomas Ellsworth never returned to West Virginia. Records from Ellis Island show that he departed on the steamship Lusitania on July 3, 1915, bound for Liverpool. There is no record of his arrival in England, nor any documentation of his movements in Europe. The last confirmed sighting of Thomas Ellsworth comes from a passenger on the Lusitania, who later recalled sharing a dinner table with an American doctor with burn scars on his face and hands, who spoke enthusiastically about his pioneering work in mental reformation. The Lusitania, of course, was sunk by a German submarine on May 7, 1915, 2 months before Ellsworth's supposed departure on the very same vessel. This discrepancy suggests that the notice in the newspaper was deliberately falsified, raising the question, where did Thomas Ellsworth actually go, and why was his departure disguised with such an easily disprovable lie? Under Frederick Ellsworth's direction, the sanatorium entered its most troubling phase. The younger Ellsworth apparently abandoned any pretense of conventional psychiatric treatment. Patient records from this period, fragmentary though they are, contain almost no mention of traditional therapies. Instead, they consist primarily of cryptic notations about progression through the stages and suitability for the final phase. The sanatorium's supply orders during this period, preserved in the records of the Coalfield General Store, show dramatic changes as well. Orders for normal medical supplies, bandages, common medications, basic foodstuffs decreased significantly. In their place were requests for unusual chemical compounds, specialized equipment, and drastically increased quantities of sedatives. Most disturbing are the orders for materials that have no obvious place in a psychiatric facility: large quantities of iron chains, specialized locks, soundproofing materials, and in one order dated October 19, 1915, 6 restraint devices as per enclosed specifications. Specifications that, unfortunately, have not survived in the records. A former employee of the sanatorium, Edgar Mills, who worked as a groundskeeper from 1914 to 1917, gave a rare interview to the Rockford Historical Society in 1972 when he was in his 80s. His account provides one of the few glimpses inside the institution during this period from someone other than the Ellsworths themselves. Mills described a facility that functioned more like a prison than a hospital. There were parts of that place where regular staff wasn't allowed to go, the annex, for one, and the sub-basement of the East Wing. Only Dr. Frederick and his special orderlies had keys to those areas. Sometimes we'd hear sounds coming from down there, even up in the gardens. Not screaming exactly. Something worse. Like people trying to scream, but they'd forgotten how. He spoke of patients he would see in the common areas who didn't seem like the same people from week to week, and of others who disappeared entirely with staff told they had been transferred or released to family care, despite no record of any such transfers or releases in the official logs. Perhaps most chilling was Mills's description of what he called the Wednesday processions. Every Wednesday, just after midnight, they'd move certain patients from the main building to the annex. They'd be heavily sedated, wrapped in sheets, carried on stretchers. But here's the strange thing. A few weeks later, people would come out of the annex, people I'd never seen before. They'd be taken to the third floor of the main building to a ward they called rehabilitation. They moved strangely, spoke rarely, and when they did, their voices were wrong somehow, like they were reading from a script they didn't understand. Mills claimed he was fired in 1917 after accidentally entering a restricted area and witnessing something he refused to describe even 55 years later. Some things, he said in the interview, are better left unsaid. Some things, once you see them, you can't ever unsee. All I'll say is this. What they were doing in there wasn't medicine. It wasn't even human. The sanatorium continued to operate under Frederick Ellsworth's direction until 1919. During these years, the institution became increasingly isolated from the surrounding community. Deliveries were left at the gates rather than brought inside. Mail was collected irregularly. Staff turnover was high, with most employees lasting only a few months before being replaced. Local newspapers from this period contain occasional references to the sanatorium, mostly in the form of notices seeking new staff or announcements of supposed medical breakthroughs. One such announcement, published in the Rockford County Telegraph in August of 1918, claimed that Dr. Frederick Ellsworth had developed a revolutionary approach to the permanent cure of moral insanity through physical reformation of the brain's degenerate structures. What exactly this physical reformation entailed isn't detailed in the public notice. However, a series of medical illustrations discovered in the sealed records of the State Medical Board in 1993 provides disturbing insights into Frederick Ellsworth's methods. These detailed anatomical drawings, bearing Frederick's signature and dated throughout 1918, depict surgical procedures involving the brain and central nervous system that go far beyond any accepted medical practice of the era, or indeed of any era. The illustrations are accompanied by notes describing a process of neural reorganization and personality reconstruction. One notation reads, "The subject's original personality structures must be systematically dismantled before reformation can begin. Memory centers are targeted first, followed by speech and motor control. Once these are properly disrupted, the new patterns can be introduced through specialized stimulation sequences." Another note, more chilling still, failure rate has decreased to approximately 30%. Of the remaining 70%, approximately half achieve full conversion, while the other half retain fragmentary elements of original personality sufficient to render them unsuitable for Phase 7. These partial successes are still useful for labor and basic functions, but cannot be released as complete specimens. The nature of the complete specimens and what release might have meant in this context remains one of the most disturbing unanswered questions in this case. The beginning of the end for the Ellsworth Sanatorium came not from any official investigation or public outcry, but from within. In late October of 1919, a fire broke out in the annex. Unlike the possibly fabricated fire of 1913, this blaze was all too real. It consumed the entire structure before spreading to the main building through the underground connecting passage. The official report from the Rockford County Fire Department describes a scene of chaos. Flames visible from town, approximately 7 miles distant. Upon arrival, fire had engulfed auxiliary structure and was spreading to main building. No staff visible on scene to assist or provide information regarding occupants. Entered main building through west entrance. Located approximately 20 individuals in common areas, many seemingly unaware of danger despite heavy smoke. Individuals displayed unusual behavior, including lack of response to verbal commands and absence of expected panic responses. The report continues. All visible occupants evacuated from main building. Staff quarters found empty. No access possible to East Wing due to advanced fire condition. Unknown if additional occupants remained in that section. Fire brought under control by morning, but structures deemed total loss. The death toll from the fire was never officially established. No bodies were recovered from the ruins, according to county records. Yet the sanatorium's last known patient count was 47, and only 20 survivors were documented in the fire report. In the days following the fire, a peculiar series of events unfolded in Coalfield and the surrounding communities. Police reports from November 1919 document multiple sightings of disoriented individuals wandering the roads and forests around Blackwater Ridge. These individuals were described as unusually pale, minimally communicative, and exhibiting strange, mechanical movements. Several were taken into custody and eventually transferred to other psychiatric facilities across the state. Records of these transfers exist, but the subsequent medical files of these individuals appear to have been either lost or deliberately removed from archives. Frederick Ellsworth himself vanished after the fire. No death certificate was ever filed, nor was he among the documented survivors. His disappearance generated surprisingly little official concern or investigation at the time, a fact that some researchers attribute to the significant influence the Ellsworth family still wielded in the region, even after the destruction of their infamous sanatorium. The ruins of the Ellsworth Sanatorium remained untouched for decades, avoided by locals who claimed the site was haunted. It wasn't until 1974, during a state-mandated forestry survey, that the unmarked graves behind the East Wing were discovered, leading to the first official investigation of what had truly transpired on Blackwater Ridge. The investigation, conducted jointly by the West Virginia State Police and the State Historical Society, uncovered many of the documents referenced in this account. However, the investigation was abruptly terminated in 1976, with all findings sealed by court order. The official explanation cited lack of actionable evidence regarding crimes committed over 50 years prior. This premature conclusion to the investigation has led some to suggest that influential families in the region, perhaps descendants of those who had committed relatives to the sanatorium or who had been involved in its operations, may have exerted pressure to keep certain details from becoming public. It wasn't until 1992, when the sealing order expired, that researchers and historians gained access to the investigation files. What they found was a collection of disturbing evidence that raised more questions than it answered. Among these materials was a leather-bound journal discovered in a hidden compartment in what had been Frederick Ellsworth's private office in the sanatorium. The journal, spanning from 1915 to 1919, details what Frederick called the Great Work, a project far more ambitious and terrifying than mere psychiatric treatment. Entries in the journal suggest that the Ellsworths weren't simply trying to cure their patients. They were attempting to erase and replace their very identities. One entry, dated March 3, 1916, reads, "Uncle Thomas's original vision was too limited. He sought merely to correct defective minds, to render the degenerate compliant. I see now a greater possibility, not just to repair, but to remake, to create the ideal mind within the flawed vessel. Later entries become increasingly grandiose and detached from conventional morality. An entry from January 19, 1918. Subject 23 represents our greatest success to date. All traces of the original personality have been completely eradicated. The new identity has been successfully implanted and stabilized. She now responds only to her designated name and identifier. Her memories before awakening in our care are entirely consistent with the constructed narrative. The transition is complete, and most disturbing of all, an entry from just 2 weeks before the fire, dated October 12, 1919. The first releases have been successfully integrated into their designated communities. Reports from our observers indicate no suspicion or recognition of substitution. Phase 7 is viable on a larger scale. We can begin the systematic replacement program as soon as the new facility is operational. What exactly Frederick meant by releases, substitution, and systematic replacement has been the subject of intense speculation among researchers. Some suggest that the Ellsworths were engaged in a delusional attempt to replace certain members of society with patients they had reprogrammed to serve some unknown purpose. While this may seem like the stuff of science fiction, certain evidence suggests disturbing real-world applications of whatever procedures the Ellsworths had developed. Census records from Coalfield and surrounding communities show several instances where individuals who had been reported dead or missing suddenly reappeared in the years following 1919, often with explanations of extended travel or recovery from illness. In some cases, family members noted subtle but persistent changes in personality and behavior in these returned individuals. One such case involved William Garrett, a coal miner who disappeared in 1917. He was presumed dead after a week-long search yielded no trace of him. Yet, in December of 1919, approximately 6 weeks after the sanatorium fire, Garrett reappeared in Coalfield, claiming to have been working at a mine in a neighboring county. Census records confirm his return, as do local newspaper accounts. However, a diary kept by Garrett's wife, discovered during a house renovation in 1987, tells a different story. In entries spanning from December 1919 to March 1920, Martha Garrett documented subtle but unsettling changes in her husband. William doesn't remember things he should. Our wedding day, the birth of our son, the names of friends he's known all his life. When I mention these lapses, he becomes confused, then angry. Another entry reads, "He moves differently, sits perfectly still for hours, speaks differently, with words he never knew before. Sometimes I catch him practicing expressions in the mirror, like he's trying to remember how to smile. And most chillingly, I'm afraid to sleep in the same room with him. Last night I woke to find him standing over me, just staring. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was observing natural sleep patterns. My William never spoke like that. I don't think this is my William at all." Martha Garrett's diary ends abruptly in March of 1920. County records show that she was committed to the state psychiatric hospital in April of that same year, diagnosed with delusional paranoia. She died there 3 months later. The cause of death is listed as heart failure, a suspiciously vague diagnosis for a woman who was 32 years old and had no prior history of heart problems. William Garrett continued to live in Coalfield until 1942. Town records describe him as a quiet man who kept to himself. He never remarried and apparently maintained only minimal contact with his son, who was raised by Martha's sister. Upon his death, an autopsy revealed unusual surgical scars on his skull, hidden beneath his hair, scars that had no corresponding medical records explaining their origin. Similar cases have been documented in communities throughout Rockford County and neighboring areas, all following the same pattern: individuals who disappeared only to return changed in subtle but profound ways, often followed by the institutionalization or unexplained death of family members who noticed these changes. The question this raises is as disturbing as it is incredible. How many replacements were successfully integrated into society? And to what end? The fire that destroyed the Ellsworth Sanatorium in 1919 might have been the end of the story, a tragic but concluding chapter in a dark episode of medical history. Evidence suggests, however, that it was merely the end of one phase of a larger operation. A series of property records discovered in state archives in 2001 reveal that in early 1919, months before the fire, Frederick Ellsworth purchased a large tract of land in neighboring Preston County, approximately 40 miles from the original sanatorium site. Building permits were filed for what was described as a private research facility, with construction scheduled to begin in November of that year. This facility was never built, at least not officially. The property remained undeveloped according to county records. Yet aerial photographs taken during a U.S. Geological Survey in 1953 show what appears to be the foundations of a large structure and several smaller outbuildings at the site, none of which appear in any official property records. A ground survey conducted in 2003 found these foundations still visible beneath decades of forest growth. Carbon dating of materials from the site suggests construction consistent with the early 1920s after the sanatorium fire, but during the period when Frederick Ellsworth had officially vanished. Most intriguing of all, the survey team discovered a sealed underground chamber beneath what would have been the central building. Inside was a single metal filing cabinet containing what appeared to be patient records, though using a coding system rather than names. These records date from 1920 to 1921 and describe procedures similar to those documented in the Ellsworth Sanatorium, but with references to improved techniques and higher success rates. The records end abruptly in June of 1921 with a final notation, project suspended pending resolution of external interference, all subjects to be processed according to Emergency Protocol 7. Facility to be sealed until safe resumption possible. What caused this sudden suspension of Frederick Ellsworth's continued work remains unknown. No records exist of any official investigation or intervention at the site. No newspaper accounts mention the facility or its closure. It's as if the entire operation simply vanished as completely as Frederick himself. The story of the Ellsworth Sanatorium and whatever followed it represents one of the darkest chapters in the medical history of West Virginia, a chapter that might never be fully understood or explained. The fragmentary evidence that remains raises disturbing questions about what truly happened to the patients who entered that facility, what procedures they endured, and whether some of them might have left not as themselves, but as something else entirely. In 1978, an elderly resident of Coalfield named Joseph Turner gave an interview to a graduate student researching the history of psychiatric care in Appalachia. Turner, who would have been a young man when the sanatorium was in operation, made a statement that perhaps best captures the lingering shadow of the Ellsworth legacy. Folks around here don't talk much about the old place up on Blackwater Ridge. Not because they've forgotten, but because they remember too well. After the fire, when those strange folks started showing up in town, folks who looked like people we knew but didn't act right, that's when the real fear set in. Because you'd be talking to someone you'd known all your life, and suddenly you'd get this feeling, this cold certainty, that you were actually talking to a stranger. A stranger wearing a familiar face. Turner continued, "My own cousin Elijah was one of them that came back different, gone for 8 months, then just showed up one day saying he'd been working timber over in Hampshire County. But Elijah had been afraid of the forest his whole life on account of getting lost in it as a boy. The man that came back didn't have that fear, didn't seem to have any fears at all, and his eyes, there was nothing behind them. Just emptiness where a soul should be." When asked what he thought had happened at the sanatorium, Turner was silent for a long moment before responding. "I think those doctors found a way to empty people out, to hollow them out like gourds and fill them up with something else. Something that could wear a human face and speak with a human voice but wasn't human at all. And I think some of those things are still walking around today, still living in houses, still working in shops and mines, looking just like regular folks until you catch them at certain moments when they think no one's watching, and they forget to pretend." The lands where both the original sanatorium and the mysterious secondary facility stood have since been incorporated into the Monongahela National Forest. No markers or memorials indicate what once transpired there. The ruins have been largely reclaimed by nature, visible now only as stone foundations and collapsed walls partially buried beneath decades of forest growth. The records that survive, the journals, ledgers, architectural plans, and correspondence, remain archived in various historical collections across West Virginia. They tell a fragmented story of medical ambition twisted into something monstrous, of human experimentation conducted far from oversight, and of lives not merely destroyed but potentially transformed in ways that defy conventional understanding. What became of Frederick Ellsworth after the apparent abandonment of his second facility in 1921? No death certificate exists. No further property records bear his name. He simply vanished from historical record as completely as many of his patients. Yet in 1954, more than 30 years after his disappearance, a curious incident occurred in a small town in northern Virginia, approximately 200 miles from Blackwater Ridge. A local physician named Dr. Franklin Reed was arrested after several patients reported unusual surgical procedures performed without their knowledge or consent, procedures that left them with unexplained periods of memory loss and subtle personality changes. When authorities searched Reed's home, they discovered journals detailing techniques eerily similar to those described in the Ellsworth records. They also found a photograph dated 1919 showing a group of men in medical coats standing before what appears to be the Ellsworth Sanatorium. One of these men is clearly identifiable as Frederick Ellsworth. Most disturbing of all was Reed's office calendar, which listed a series of appointments with individuals identified only by number rather than name. Next to each entry was a notation, phase assessment. Dr. Reed was held for questioning for 72 hours before being released, due to what court records describe as inconsistencies in witness testimony and lack of physical evidence. The case was dismissed without trial. Less than a week later, Reed sold his practice and left the area. His subsequent whereabouts remained unknown until 1963, when a death certificate was filed in a small town in Oregon for a Franklin Reed, with the cause of death listed as natural causes. The investigating officer in the Reed case, Detective Howard Mercer, continued to pursue the matter unofficially for years afterward. His personal files, donated to the Virginia State Historical Society after his death in 1989, contain extensive notes on his investigation, including several disturbing observations that never made it into official reports. One such note reads, "Reed's physical appearance does not match birth certificate. Certificate indicates Reed born 1910, making him 44 at time of arrest. Subject appears minimum 65 to 70. When questioned about discrepancy, Reed stated birth certificate contained error. No way to verify, as Town Records Office, where certificate originated, suffered fire in 1937. Another entry, more troubling still, 3 patients who initially came forward with complaints against Reed have withdrawn statements. All 3 exhibit marked personality changes since initial interviews. 1. Mrs. Eleanor Simmons, previously hysterical and detailed in her account, now speaks in monotone, denies ever making accusations. Her husband reports she's not been herself since returning from what she described as a follow-up appointment with an associate of Reed's the day before changing her statement. Mercer's notes contain a final observation that suggests a direct connection to the Ellsworth case. Reed's surgical instruments include several unusual devices not standard to medical practice. One tool, a specialized cranial drill with unusual modifications, bears the engraved initials F.E. When questioned about this, Reed claimed the instrument belonged to his mentor but refused to provide name. Tool matches description in Rockford County inventory of items ordered by Ellsworth Sanatorium in 1918. The implication that Frederick Ellsworth might have assumed a new identity as Franklin Reed and continued his work decades after the closure of his facilities is difficult to prove conclusively. Yet the similarities in methodology, the physical evidence of the engraved surgical tool, and the discrepancies in Reed's age all suggest a disturbing possibility that whatever project the Ellsworths had initiated might have continued long after the sanatorium fire, operating in the shadows of legitimate medical practice. The Reed investigation appears to have been the last official encounter with anything directly connected to the Ellsworth case. In the decades since, the story has faded into local legend, occasionally revived by historians or curious journalists, but never fully explained or resolved. Yet there remains one final, troubling epilogue to this story. In 1997, an elderly woman named Grace Harmon was admitted to a nursing home in Morgantown, West Virginia, suffering from advanced dementia. During her admission interview, conducted in a rare moment of lucidity, she made a statement that caught the attention of a staff member with an interest in local history. According to the interview transcript, "I wasn't always Grace. I was someone else before, someone whose name I'm not allowed to remember. They took me to that place on the ridge. The doctors there, they did something to my head. When I woke up, I was Grace. They gave me all of Grace's memories, but sometimes I still remember bits of being the other person. The real Grace, I think they killed her. I think they killed me too, in a way." When asked to elaborate, Harmon became agitated and confused, eventually retreating into incoherence. Subsequent attempts to discuss the matter only yielded similar episodes of distress. She died 6 months later, without ever providing further details about her cryptic statement. An investigation of her background revealed several inconsistencies. Records showed that Grace Harmon had indeed existed. Born in Coalfield in 1899, graduated from the local school in 1917. Yet photographs of the young Grace from school records bear only a passing resemblance to the woman who died in the nursing home in 1998. More telling still, medical records from 1920 show that the original Grace Harmon was admitted to a hospital in Rockford County with symptoms of tuberculosis in February of that year. No discharge record exists. 2 months later, in April 1920, Grace appeared in Coalfield again, apparently recovered. Friends and family noted her improved health, but also commented on subtle changes in her personality, which they attributed to her illness and recovery. She married in 1922, raised 3 children, and lived what appeared to be a normal, unremarkable life until the onset of dementia in her 90s brought her to the nursing home and brought her disturbing claim to light. Was this woman truly a replacement? Someone subjected to the Ellsworth's procedures and given the identity of Grace Harmon? The evidence is circumstantial at best. Yet the pattern matches others observed in the aftermath of the sanatorium's operation. A person disappears, returns changed, with the changes explained away by illness or travel, and lives out a life that appears normal on the surface. How many others might there have been? How many families in the community surrounding Blackwater Ridge unknowingly welcomed home not their loved ones, but strangers wearing familiar faces? And if Frederick Ellsworth did indeed resurface as Franklin Reed decades later, how many more replacements might have been created long after the sanatorium itself was reduced to ruins? These questions may never be fully answered. Most of those who might have known the truth, whether as perpetrators, victims, or witnesses, are long dead. The physical evidence has largely crumbled to dust or been scattered across countless archives and collections. What remains is a fragmentary outline of something terrible, a shadow of a horror too methodical and patient to fit comfortably into conventional understandings of human depravity. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Ellsworth case is not what it reveals, but what it suggests. That beneath the veneer of ordinary life, hidden horrors may exist undetected for generations. That the person living next door, working in the next office, or even sharing your home might not be who they appear to be, might not even be who they believe themselves to be. In the years since the details of the Ellsworth case began to emerge from sealed records and forgotten archives, researchers have identified dozens of similar patterns across Appalachia and beyond. Cases of disappeared individuals who returned changed, of unusual medical practices conducted in isolated facilities, of physicians with questionable methods and mysterious backgrounds. Are these merely echoes of the Ellsworth operation, or evidence of something more widespread? Did the techniques developed on Blackwater Ridge spread to other practitioners, other institutions? Is it possible that what began in that stone building on a remote West Virginia ridge grew into something larger and more insidious, a hidden current flowing beneath the surface of 20th century medical history? The ruins of the Ellsworth Sanatorium still stand, though few venture there. Local residents avoid the area, claiming the ridge is haunted, not by conventional ghosts, but by something more unsettling, the sense of being watched by something that understands human behavior but doesn't share in human nature. Hikers who strayed near the ruins report a peculiar experience, the feeling of meeting someone on the trail who looks human, speaks normally, but nevertheless emanates a profound wrongness that defies articulation. Like talking to something wearing a person as a costume, as one account describes it. These encounters typically end with the strange individual walking into the forest, often in the direction of the old sanatorium grounds. Such reports are, of course, impossible to verify and easily dismissed as campfire tales or the product of overactive imaginations influenced by knowledge of the site's history. Yet their consistency, spanning decades of separate encounters by individuals often unaware of the details of the Ellsworth case, lends them a disturbing credibility. In 2012, a team from the West Virginia Paranormal Research Society conducted an overnight investigation at the sanatorium ruins. Their equipment recorded no unusual phenomena, but the team's report includes a curious incident. At approximately 2:17 in the morning, the exact time the telegram about escaping patients was sent, in 1915, one investigator separated from the group, claiming to have seen two figures moving among the ruins. When he returned 40 minutes later, team members noted he seemed disoriented and speaking oddly. He insisted nothing unusual had occurred and became increasingly agitated when questioned. The team leader reported that the investigator's affect seemed completely changed, as though a different personality was operating within a familiar body. The investigator resigned from the society upon returning home and broke off contact with former colleagues. Attempts to follow up with him for this account were unsuccessful. His last known communication, an email sent to the society's director, contained a single cryptic line. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. Some transformations, once begun, cannot be reversed. Is there truth to any of these reports, these suggestions that something of the Ellsworth's work survives to the present day? Or are they merely the way we process a historical horror, too clinical and methodical to fit comfortably into our understanding of human cruelty? By transforming it into something supernatural, something that can be contained within the familiar framework of ghost stories and haunted places? Perhaps the most rational explanation is that the Ellsworth Sanatorium was simply an extreme example of the abuses common in early psychiatric institutions, its unusual aspects exaggerated by time and retelling. That Frederick Ellsworth was merely an unethical physician conducting crude experimental procedures, not the architect of some grand and terrible replacement program. That the inconsistencies in the stories of those who returned changed after disappearances were the product of trauma or illness, not evidence of identity substitution. Yet the records remain, with their clinical descriptions of vacancy preparation and personality reconstruction. The architectural plans exist, with their unusually small rooms and drainage systems. The private journals continue to describe, in detached, methodical prose, procedures that defy both medical ethics and common human decency. And somewhere in Appalachia, perhaps in your own community, there may still live the last few individuals who returned from absence changed in subtle ways that loved ones noticed but could not name, the last echoes of whatever occurred on Blackwater Ridge in the early years of the 20th century. The next time you encounter someone familiar, a neighbor, a colleague, a family member, who seems somehow changed, whose reactions don't quite match your expectations, whose memories seem inconsistent with your shared past, consider this. What if the Ellsworths succeeded? What if their techniques for emptying out a human being and refilling that vessel with something else were perfected and propagated? What if the replacements walk among us still, unaware even themselves of what they truly are? And what if somewhere in the deep forests of West Virginia, in a facility whose existence appears in no official record, built on land owned by a person who doesn't exist, the work continues still? What if new vessels are still being prepared, new identities still being constructed, new replacements still being readied for release? Sleep well tonight. And if you wake to find someone watching you, someone whose face is familiar, but whose eyes seem somehow empty, remember the warning of Joseph Turner, who knew the truth of Blackwater Ridge. Some of those things are still walking around today, looking just like regular folks until you catch them at certain moments when they think no one's watching and they forget to pretend. Some doors once opened cannot be closed again. Some stories once told cannot be unheard, and some horrors once conceived cannot be contained. The ruins of Ellsworth Sanatorium stand silent on Blackwater Ridge, slowly crumbling back into the earth. But what was created there may outlast the stones themselves, may outlast even the memory of the men who built that terrible place and conducted their great work within its walls. Listen carefully in the silence of night. Watch closely the faces of those around you. And remember that the most terrifying monsters are not those that hunt in darkness, but those that hide in plain sight, wearing the masks of ordinary people, waiting for the moment when it's safe to reveal what lies beneath the human facade. For in the final analysis, the true horror of the Ellsworth legacy is not what was done to those unfortunate souls confined within the sanatorium walls. The true horror is the possibility that those souls, or what replaced them, might be sitting across from you at this very moment, watching you through familiar eyes that conceal something unutterably alien behind their gaze. The hour grows late, and this account must end. But the story itself continues, written in the subtle wrongness of a loved one's changed behavior, in the inexplicable gaps in community records, in the lingering questions that no historian or investigator has fully answered. Perhaps decades from now, another researcher will uncover new evidence, will piece together more fragments of the puzzle, will bring to light some new aspect of the Ellsworth case that has until now remained hidden. Until then, we are left with questions, with suspicions, with the unnerving possibility that the boundary between human and something else, something manufactured within the walls of that stone building on Blackwater Ridge, might be more permeable than we dare to imagine. Lock your doors tonight. Look carefully at the faces of those you love. And remember the words found scrawled on the wall of what was once Frederick Ellsworth's office, discovered during the 1974 investigation, but omitted from official reports. They look like you, they sound like you, but they are not you. And soon there will be more of them than there are of us. The mystery of what truly happened at the Ellsworth Sanatorium may never be fully solved, but perhaps that's for the best. Some truths are too terrible to be known in their entirety. Some horrors are best left buried beneath the weight of time and the merciful obscurity of incomplete records. This has been the documented account of the Ellsworth Sanatorium. Sleep well, if you still can. And remember, not all monsters hide in shadows. Some wear the faces of those we trust most, and some may not even know that they are monsters at all.